Thank you very much. Without any further ado, I'll just hand straight to John to take us through these questions that you've submitted and look forward to hearing his response. Thank you, John.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions. You're now about to experience a Q&A. That's a very inadequate kind of procedure, obviously, because all I can do is respond to these questions off the top of my head. I just hope there's something beneath the top of my head that will help me to give an approach to the question. But of course, many of these questions deserve a full lecture or more. That doesn't matter, because if I can get you going even on the wrong track, and that could happen, the more important thing is that if it's your question and you're serious about it and not just asking it to see what I know, that does sometimes happen, then the work you do when you go home afterwards, that'll be the most important work you do in trying to get your question answered. If your question wasn't serious, you won't do that, you know. So we'll see what happens by what you do subsequently. And I wish you well. Very interesting questions they are. Do you ever tackle the question, who or what created God? Yes. The next question is, I am keen on logic, ladies and gentlemen. You see, the question was, do I tackle it? Yes, I do. But would you like me to tackle it? You would? Okay. It's a very interesting thing. It's a phenomenon, really, that I used to meet this question among school kids in the UK and among older people in Russia, but never among professors in our universities. And then I discovered that Dawkins makes it a plank of the God delusion. If you claim that God created the universe, then you'll have to ask logically, who created God? Where did God come from? And who created the God that created the God that created the God? And so it goes on ad absurdum. And so the whole thing is ridiculous. Let's forget God and go back to playing football. That kind of argument. And it sounds very impressive, but it's as hollow as it could possibly be. It's not too late at night. Let's go in for a little bit more logic. So let's look at the question in the abstract. Who or what created X? Many questions have assumptions, either explicitly put into them or implicitly hidden in them. And this is one of those questions that has an assumption built into it. What created X? You're assuming that X is created. So if you ask who created God, you're assuming God is created. But what if he wasn't? Your question isn't even relevant. See, the very interesting thing is the only God whom anybody has ever taken seriously is an eternal God, uncreated. So the question simply doesn't apply. But you think it does. And Dawkins thinks it does. Secondly, of course, who or what created X applies to X's that are created. So in particular, it applies to our own universe. So I confronted Dawkins with this, and you can see it on YouTube. I said, you believe that the universe created you. Okay then, tell me who created your creator. Well, I asked him that about 10 or 11 years ago. I'm still waiting for an answer. Now, what lies behind that, you see, is that we're asking about ultimate reality. And one of the questions that came in at the end was, are questions of ultimate purpose and meaning not non-questions? Well, they're not non-questions because we can ask them and they make perfect sense. And in fact, atheists ask them and people like me ask them. And that's the issue here. You see, do the questions go back forever and ever, as in Dawkins' view, or do they stop? And I find both for Christians like myself, they stop. The ultimate reality is God. God never came to be. He is uncreated. Now, there's a very important corollary of that. Somebody asked me about the universe came from nothing. We as Christians, I'm reading, believe that God came from nothing. So how would you answer this? By pointing out it's incorrect. There is no claim in Scripture or anywhere else that God came from nothing. We need to get this straight, ladies and gentlemen. God is not physical. God is spirit. The primary reality in the universe is not material. Logos, the word is spirit. That's the primary reality in the universe. All else is derivative. Whereas the materialists believe the opposite. The primary reality is either nothing or the multiverse or mass energy and so on and so forth. Now, what does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. That is an existence statement. That is the Word already was. The Word is eternal. The universe came to be through the Word. The universe hasn't always been in existence. Now, as for God himself, God causes the universe to be. He never came to be. The universe came from nothing physical. Didn't come from nothing. Because God isn't nothing. Now we need to unscramble a little bit of thinking here. The universe is caused by God who is spirit. He's not physical. So the universe doesn't come from anything physical. It comes from God who is spirit. Now my atheist friends, they believe in ultimate reality also. It usually is mass energy, nothing, the multiverse. The questions stop. And as some eminent theologian well put it, the question is not, is there ultimate reality? Yes, there is. The question we all have to answer is, which reality is ultimate? All of us have got a conception of ultimate reality. Right, let's move on a little bit and see this next. Aren't God and faith a self-fulfilled prophecy? Well, this is the Freudian question again that I attempted to answer and was obviously totally unsuccessful, but that's all right. What would you mean by God being a self-fulfilled prophecy? I can understand people saying God is a wish fulfillment, but that's the Freudian view. And all you have to say to that, atheism could be a wish fulfillment. So where do you go from there? Well, you have to break out of that circle by asking for evidence. There's no use stating things like this that are pure Freudian psychology, which work both ways, because they cancel each other out. But prophecies are usually things said by people predicting something, and I don't know how that fits. Is faith a self-fulfilled prophecy? But faith in what? People bandy the word faith around in common discourse. I always say, faith in what, please? What are you talking about? Faith in itself is an incomplete thing. I have faith in what? It could be cabbages, or it could be stars, or it could even be a Glasgow football club, but I'll say nothing about that. Hello, I hope you're well. Well, that's very nice. The Bible talks about men who live to 800, 900, 400, etc. How would that even be possible, saying, as with modern medicine, people don't live past 120? I haven't a notion. Not a notion, really. Although I hear from some of the medics in their work on telomeres and other things that they're hoping to extend our lifespan until we can live to these great old ages. It's possible, of course, when you think about it. Humanity hasn't, on any showing, been here forever. And if God created the original humans, then they were by definition less damaged than we are. And so it's certainly conceivable from a theoretical point of view, although how we would establish it is another matter, that humans did in the past live for long periods of time. And it could be we discover certain trace elements or certain ways of manipulating genetics in order to make people live for longer. I'm not sure what relevance that has, but it's an interesting question. Who would you have considered your most frustrating opponent? And secondly, who do you think is the face of the atheistic movement today? You know, when you're asked questions like this, you're being asked to say things about people that you'd frequently rather not say. You see, when I go into debate, or when I did, my attitude was something my parents taught me years ago in Northern Ireland, and that was to respect everybody and regard them as being made in the image of God no matter what they believed. And therefore, that is my attitude in debating. I try to befriend people. Now, of course, frustrations arise, but are the frustrations because I'm not able to handle a situation? Or are these just frustrating people in that they hold views different to mine? Well, that would be a great pity to sink them for that reason. So this is not the kind of question that I'm going to answer, because you're inviting me to comment on what I think of other people, and that's not the way debates go forward. So I'm sorry about that, but there it is. The way we treat people is so important. I had a debate with Peter Singer. Perhaps I should share this just to indicate it. The most famous ethicist in the world, who has absolutely abhorrent views on ethics. He thinks that particularly disabled children, parents should be able to put them down. And ideas like that. And before I debated him, I got the most vicious letters from professing Christians telling me to eviscerate him and all this kind of stuff. Well, when I encountered him, I pointed out that his views were abhorrent to me, but that they stemmed from his atheism, and therefore we'd have a look at his atheism. And then I recommended one of his books that I'd found very challenging as a Christian. Afterwards, he came and shook my hand. And he said, you know, I want to thank you. I said, for what? He said, no one has ever treated me, no Christian has ever treated me like you did today. This is what counts, ladies and gentlemen. People have all kinds of hang-ups and difficulties, and even if they strike me as frustrated or hurting, there are reasons for that. And if I try to tackle it simply on the level of answering arguments or demolishing arguments possibly, and don't get through to that hurt, I've actually done more damage than I've done good. And we all need to learn, whatever worldview we're coming from. That's the way to learn in life, is to open ourselves to discussion with other people. Do you think that science should have a major role in religion, and why? Do you think science as an institution is like religion in itself, in the sense that some people believe in science just as people do in religion? Well, I think I know what's behind this. Because in the 1860s and thereabouts, Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, was very keen on abolishing amateur scientists like Bishop Wilberforce and establishing a church scientific dedicated to the worship of the Greek goddess of wisdom, Sophia, and replacing the priests and ministers of the church by scientists as a professional body. And there are some people that have a kind of religious fervor about their science, but we need to be desperately careful here, because religion is a word that covers a vast number of things. See, my Christianity I don't really regard as a religion. It's a personal relationship. We'll come on to that in a few moments. But it's important, I think, to realize that there are dangers of hubris in science, and there are dangers of hubris in certain aspects of religion that can put people off in a big, big way. We all could do with a huge dose of humility. But science having a major role in religion doesn't make any sense to me if we're talking about Christianity, which is the only religion as such that I know very much about. Science has a major role in my life, but it doesn't eclipse the Bible by any means. This is my rule and authority in life. Science has been my professional life, so to speak. Now, let's have a look here. There is much talk of living in a simulation. Yes, there is. Elon Musk thinks we may be living in a simulation and so on. How can we know there isn't a digital matrix from which we must escape? Well, that actually isn't a particularly easy question to answer. I can only express personal opinion. And that has to do with my Christianity, because I do believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the Christian faith is not simply helpful, but it's true. And that we're being given information about the actual nature of the universe. Now, are we in a simulation? No, but we are created similar to, in the image of the living God. That's a huge thing. It's actually one of the reasons I'm a Christian, because I don't find it in any other philosophy. Just think, as you sit there, of the dignity that gives you. You know, the sun is beautiful, especially if you look at it through a solar telescope, as I do from time to time. Andromeda is magnificent, and so are the Pleiades. They show God's glory, but they were not made in his image. You were. And one of my ways of investigating competing worldviews in life has been, what value do they place on a human being? Christianity is, as far as I can see, unique. These are maybe just straws in the wind, but they're very important, because I meet so many young people, particularly in university these days, and they're not solving the problem of meaning. They're bored. The word bored rarely ever occurred when I was at college. People were interested in things, they were full of things, because many people had an anchor. They had a vertical anchor connecting them to God, in whose light they saw everything else. But now that's gone in Europe. The word God doesn't even appear in the European Constitution. And people are desperate for meaning, but they're not finding it. That's why this building's full tonight. And I experience this everywhere I go, packed. Because people are rightly searching for meaning, and so am I. I'm a fellow searcher. But the wonderful thing is that it's not just us searching for meaning and trying to work our way towards God. There is the opposite process. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. A growing number of Christians are accepting evolution as the means God used for creation. Is this compatible with the Bible? In their view, it often is. But that's a huge question to ask at this time of night. How many hours have you got? So let me just say a couple of things, ladies and gentlemen. Here's another area where there's massive confusion. Now, I'm not a biologist, so I need to be very careful. I need to be careful even also because mathematicians have got a track record of skepticism. Not about the simple things that Darwin observed, the small incremental changes that we can observe. I mean, look around this room. Do we all look the same? Why not? Well, some selecting went on. Do you realize that? You know, among your parents and possibly among you, even here tonight, I don't know. And mutations affect all of us. They certainly do something. But where mathematicians, some of us have been very skeptical, is, have they the capacity to do everything? Now, here's major confusion number one. Richard Dawkins wrote a book, very brilliantly written, but very misleading. It's called The Blind Watchmaker. And in it, he claims that the blind unconscious mechanism of natural selection, which Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and variation of all of life. False. Half false. And he only corrected it recently. Evolution, whatever you think of it, whatever it does or doesn't do, does not explain the existence of organic life. Why not? Because whatever evolution is or isn't, it depends on life to do anything. So it can't explain life. That's very elementary logic. And yet, I meet dozens of people who've never seen it. The real problem, now there are huge problems associated within science, and I read about them because I'm interested in them. In what weight can you put on these mechanisms of selection? But nobody's got even to the beginning of giving a naturalistic solution to the problem of the origin of life itself. And that's all obscured in the literature. So we read evolution did it. It's nonsense. It's a contradiction in terms. As one of the most famous evolutionists said, prebiotic evolution is a contradiction in terms. Now, evolutionary mechanisms do something. They appear to alter the lengths of finch beaks. They stay finches, I notice, but let's give that a pass. Is that an argument against God? Well, of course not. You see, you cannot deduce from the existence of a mechanism the non-existence of a creator who designed the mechanism, even if some random elements involved in it. This is a self-winding watch. The random motions of my arm wind it up. So it wasn't designed, was it? Oh, yes, it was. It's a much cleverer design than other watches, you see? Now, if you want to read, if you could bear it, some of my ramblings, I nearly said, on this topic, I've written 2 books, one much easier than the other. The first book is God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? And I'm at the moment hoping to write an easier, not a dumbed down, but an easier version of it. And then I've written a book called 7 Days That Divide the World that deals more specifically with questions of Genesis. I am a skeptic, you'll discover that. But I don't think belief or non-belief in God is to be decided by biology. But it's too big a subject to go any further into that. Now, have you known atheists change their worldview through recent debate? This makes me smile. Why? Because in the aforementioned debate with Peter Singer, I told the audience, I should have told you tonight, shouldn't I, how biased I am, but you've already detected that. My parents were believers, so were my grandparents. My parents were unusual believers in that they didn't force the stuff down my throat, and they allowed me to think, so that I didn't completely jettison my Christianity when I got to Cambridge, as many of my contemporaries did. I announced to this huge audience in Sydney, Australia, in Melbourne, in the town hall, I said that my parents were Christian. So Peter Singer, I was first up, he came up and he said, well, there you are. This is my biggest objection to religion. People remain in the faith in which they were brought up. Oh, I thought this is going to be very interesting. So when I had the chance to speak, I said, Peter, I told them about my parents quite openly. You didn't tell them about yours. Tell me, were your parents atheists? He said, yes, they were. Oh, I said. You stayed in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, I'm sorry, Peter, I thought you believed it. The reactions to that were fascinating in cyberspace. He's one of the world's leading philosophers, but he didn't realize that his atheism is a belief system. But it was very amusing afterwards. Here's the question: can a person change their view? The very first person to talk to him afterwards was a friend of mine whose parents were Jews coming from Hungary. And that's exactly where Peter Singer came from. So my friend went over to Peter Singer and identified himself as Hungarian and so on and so forth. And he got on famously until my friend said, "And I became a Christian." He changed his worldview. And that's exactly what Singer didn't believe could happen. But the very first person he met that night proved the contrary. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this question is personally very important to me. Because you see, the flip side of having Christian parents, grandparents, and all the rest of them is you get to a place called Cambridge, and people ask you if you believe in God. And then they say, "Oh, you're Irish. Sorry, I should never have asked the question." All you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it. You wouldn't know anything about that in Scotland, but, you know, they do in Ireland. And then you ask yourself, could they be right? I decided as an 18-year-old, as a result of having that question put to me, that I would use my time, at least in part, to get to know people who did not share my worldview. To ask them questions, to find out why they believed what they believed. And when I saw the first one of them, who came from a kind of agnosticism, become a Christian, that was a turning point for me. People can change their worldview. You're not fatalistically hemmed into the worldview you were born with. It can change. And that is the glorious thing. So, of course, I've seen hundreds of people since. And the question was, does it happen through reasoned debate, or is it more about a work of God in their heart? That's like saying to an eagle, which of your two wings is the most important? It's a both-and situation. Now, the final thing, we've got a couple more minutes, I think. What is the thing that causes you most doubt regarding Christianity? Anthony Flew wasn't a Christian. How do you go from complicated DNA to Jesus rising from the dead? What is the hardest thing I face? Well, the hardest thing I face, ladies and gentlemen, is the hardest thing you face. And it's the problem of evil and pain. Isn't it? And in an audience this side, many people are hurting. They've had bad news from a doctor. They've had bad news from relatives. They've been disappointed in a job. They've been let down. They're bitterly hurt because of a broken relationship. This is the hard problem. The other question was, how do you get from DNA to Jesus? Anthony Flew wasn't a Christian. Well, when you read his book, you can see he was toying with Christianity. He moved to a kind of deism. That is, he saw in the DNA evidence of a mind. But so far as we can tell, and I had a lengthy interview with him before he died, he didn't quite appear to make, as far as one could see, the final step of committing himself to Christianity, although he put it on record that Christianity was the best option. And the questioner is quite correct and very perceptive to say there is a step. Most of the arguments I've used tonight are arguments keeping to the topic. Are God and faith anti-science and anti-reason? No, they are not. The title doesn't mention Jesus, but the question does. So if you don't mind, I'll just conclude by saying a couple of things about it. You see, when you go beyond the evidence the universe gives us, you have to look at different sources of evidence. What do I mean by that? Well, the claim that the Word became flesh in Jesus Christ is a historical claim. And therefore we must approach it, first of all, through the discipline of history, which is a rational discipline. It's not natural science, but it's a rational discipline. Please don't fall for the ridiculous myth that rationality and science are coextensive. Of course they're not. Otherwise, half the faculties in this university would have to close tomorrow. History can get us very close to things like the resurrection of Jesus. Now, this helps me in another question. Why do I not belong to one of the other major religions? Have I thought about them? Yes. Perhaps not as much as many of you would like me to. But you see, let's think just for a moment, very simply. My Jewish friends, and I have many of those, think that Jesus died, he did not rise. My Muslim friends think that he didn't die. I believe that he both died and rose. Those three comments on history are mutually exclusive. They cannot all be true, so how could you decide them? I know of only one way of deciding things like this, and it's a matter of evidence. Now, in order to save a long lecture, which is about not to come, I have written in great detail of my response, both as a Christian and a scientist, to the evidence for the resurrection in a little book which is very readable called Gunning for God, because so many people ask me this question. But you see, it's not only history, because the central claim of Christianity is God becomes human, and Jesus dies and rises again, and that has to do with his providing a basis of giving me and you, if you will receive him, new life, forgiveness. Now, those are words that resonate today. I talk to many people. Do you need forgiveness? Of course, we all need forgiveness, and we all know what it means. A relationship with God. And it brings me to an interesting thing that was put to me not so long ago for the first time. Somebody said, you're a scientist, but you can't be and be a Christian because, you see, in science, things are testable. Well, that's a very euphemistic view of science, but I leave it. And nothing in Christianity is testable. I say, who told you that? I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe that Christianity was testable, ladies and gentlemen. Some time ago, I was speaking in America, in Harvard, actually. Huge audience of students. And up in the balcony at the back, a Chinese student stood up at the end, and he shouted at me, "Look at me." And of course, we all looked. Seeing that he was meaning me, I said, "Why should I look at you?" He said, "Listen, 6 months ago, I heard you speak at another university in the United States. My life was in a complete mess. Broken relationships, nowhere to go." And he let out a whole stream of stuff. But he said, something you said started a chain of thinking in my heart, and not long afterwards, I became a Christian. Look at me. And his face was shining like the sun. I didn't need to say any more. It was one of the most powerful witnesses I'd seen, and the courage of the young man to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, I have often seen people, and they're in despair. They don't know where to turn. They're students without meaning. They may be addicted to narcotics or alcohol or this, that, or the other thing. And then you meet them 6 months later, and you say, what has happened to you? And they may put it in different ways. They may say, I met Jesus. They may say, I became a Christian. They may say, I trusted Christ. But they're different. The alcohol in the home has been replaced by food on the table. The broken relationships have been mended. Would you like a power that can do that? Because that is exactly what Christ offers us if we are prepared to repent and trust him. It's big stuff, ladies and gentlemen. But if what I've been saying tonight is true, this is getting near and near to the heart of reality. And I do not want any of you in 30 years' time, when I'm long gone, to think back to this evening and not to have realized what it's all about. You see, the great lie that has been spread about in our society is this: that Christianity is religion. What does that mean? It means I try and be good to my neighbor. I try and get along as best I can, and I hope that one day God is going to be kind and let me in. Many of the world's religions take that view. It's a merit-based acceptance. And you wouldn't insult another human being by using it, would you? Sometimes I illustrate this. I met a girl a long time ago. She was the first girl I saw, I think, when I got to Cambridge. So I decided it'd be good to marry her, so I came and brought her a present, Mrs. Beaton's cooking. So I said, Sally, I'd like you to be my wife. Now look at this. Here are the laws for making apple cake. Thou shalt take so much sugar. Thou shalt take so much milk. Thou shalt take so many apples. And thou shalt cook them together at 1,000 degrees, and you'll make an apple cake. Now, it's going to be like this. If you keep these rules pretty well for the next 30 or 40 years, I will think of accepting you. Otherwise, you can go back to your mother. Why are you laughing, ladies and gentlemen? Because I would guarantee there are many people sitting in front of me, and that's exactly what they think of God. If I do this, if I do that, and try all my life, then you'll accept me. Let me repeat it. It sounds blunt and blatant, but it's true. You wouldn't insult a fellow human being by basing your relationship with them on merit. Now, what is the secret of a decent marriage relationship? It's that she accepted me at the beginning, not at the end. And I accepted her at the beginning, not at the end. And this is what God offers us. In Christ, He will accept us at the beginning. So that as I sit here, the biggest thing in my life is not the science. It's interesting. It's important. It points towards God. But the things that gets me right to God is the fact that Christ loved me and gave Himself for me. And He has given me life many years ago. So I'm not trying to do this lecture tonight to earn brownie points so that God will say, Lennox, you know, that was a good lecture. Thank you very much for you're a bit nearer in. No. I'm doing this lecture not to gain acceptance, but because I've got it. Think about it, ladies and gentlemen, because it is by far and away the biggest thing in life. And it would be sad to reject Christianity, as many do, without ever having understood what it was. Good night, and thank you very much.